as soon as you put food in your mouth. After we have the physical breakdown of food, we then start with the chemical breakdown of food. So the physical breaks it into smaller pieces, the chemical then takes over where the physical leaves off. So chemical digestion occurs after the physical digestion. These are primarily consisting of hydrolysis reactions. Remember, what is hydrolysis from chemistry 1401? What is the phrase hydro? Water. What is lysis? Break apart. So basically it's just using water molecules to break apart the molecules. Remember when we talked about the biological molecules, things like the lipids, proteins, polysaccharides, and fatty acids. The way that those get put together is you remove the water condensation reactions to build the molecules. The way you break them apart is through hydrolysis reactions. You add a water molecule to break them into small subunits. So digestion is simply using this process of hydrolysis. The hydrolysis reactions release the subunit molecules that the body can then absorb and use for nutrients. So it's using water to split the large macromolecules. Once you have these split, you then have to absorb them. That is also the process of digestion. So the products that are produced through this splitting of the macromolecules pass through the epithelial lining of the cell of the digestive tract. Because remember, every single organ, every single structure in the body is lined with epithelial cells. So they pass through this epithelial cells, eventually entering the bloodstream so that they can be passed around and sent to any part of the body that needs them. Ultimately, you do produce wastes. We are not 100% efficient. So we do have wastes and byproducts that are produced. Those need to be excreted. Because we have a unidirectional flow, we have an entrance, we also have an exit. So the wastes are excreted through the anus. So that's sort of an overview of what this general process of digestion is. What we're going to go through is sort of what's going on in each stage of this process. What's being broken down? How is the stage, are these stages working? So we're going to sort of talk about a general vertebrate digestive system. Now, if you recall, I've been referring to these as the tube within a tube structure. So the digestive tract, the gastrointestinal tract, is that internal tube. It enters on one end of the tube, food passes through, and it passes out on the other end. But the digestive system itself also contains a variety of accessory organs, structures that aid the process of digestion, things like the liver, the pancreas, and the gallbladder, and we'll go through sort of what those structures do as well. So as we're moving through, the key thing to remember is that we're talking about this specialization. Specialization allows for this differential function. We can have this breakdown of processes because we have this unidirectional flow. So this sort of the generalized flow, we start off with the mouth and the pharynx. This is the entry point. The esophagus is the next location. It's sort of a delivery system. If food enters the mouth, we don't actually have any significant chemical breakdown to take place. There is a little bit that does, which we'll talk about, but we have to deliver it to the area where the primary chemical breakdown occurs. This is the stomach. So the esophagus delivers the food to the stomach. So the stomach is sort of where a lot of the preliminary digestion takes place. At this point, we do still have some physical breakdown of food, but we really start the detail of the chemical breakdown. From there, the food moves to the small intestine. Digestion continues in the small intestine, and we start the process of absorption there as well. From there, it moves to the large intestine. Digestion does not occur in the large intestine, but we do have the absorption of minerals, nutrients, and the absorption of water. And this is especially important because water is absolutely critical for life, so we need to have a mechanism in this large intestine for absorbing water and controlling the water balance. Ultimately, you have waste. These are excreted through the cloaca or the rectum. Cloaca are found in reptiles and a few other mammals like the monotremes. Rectums are found in other mammals. So that's sort of an overview of what we're going to be talking about in a little bit more detail. The accessory organs we'll be talking about include things like the liver, which produces bile, the gallbladder, which helps store and concentrate the bile, the pancreas, which produces pancreatic juices. And they also produce additional digestive enzymes, but they also produce a bicarbonate buffer. Sodium bicarbonate or bicarbonate is a buffer to help control acidity. And so sort of be thinking about where you might expect that to be found if we're talking about the body producing this. So this is sort of an overview of the vertebrate digestive system. Not just limited to humans, but we use humans because we understand them to some degree. So let's go through a quick animation here, sort of going through what the process of digestion and what organs are involved, and then we'll go through and talk about them in detail.
The primary functions of the digestive system are the breakdown of food, called digestion, and absorption of nutrients. Digestion begins in the mouth, where the teeth break food into smaller particles during mastication. Salivary glands located near the oral cavity secrete saliva, which begins chemical digestion and keeps the food moist. As food is swallowed, the soft palate blocks the upper pharynx to prevent food from entering the nasal cavity, and multiple voluntary muscles in the face, neck, and tongue contract, pushing food particles through the pharynx. The food passes over the epiglottis, which prevents food entry into the respiratory system, and then into the esophagus, which connects the pharynx to the stomach. The one-way movement of the food mass, now called a bolus, is controlled by wave-like involuntary muscle contractions. This movement is known as peristalsis. The bolus now enters the stomach. Folds in the stomach wall, called rugae, allow for expansion as the stomach fills. Stomach cells secrete hydrochloric acid, pepsinogen, and various regulatory hormones that chemically digest the bolus. Muscular contractions in the stomach churn its contents to further break down the bolus and mix it with stomach secretions to form a thick liquid called chyme. Chyme exits the stomach through the pyloric sphincter and enters the small intestine, the major site of nutrient absorption. The small intestine consists of three parts: the duodenum, jejunum, and ileum. Bile from the liver and digestive enzymes from the pancreas empty into the duodenum to aid in digestion. Absorbed nutrients pass from the lumen of the small intestine into blood and lymph. Chyme not absorbed in the small intestine enters the large intestine. As it passes through the cecum and ascending, transverse, descending, and sigmoid colon, water and salts are absorbed and chyme is converted into feces. The rectum stores feces until nervous stimulation initiates the defecation reflex, resulting in elimination through the anal canal.
Very polite way to describe it, isn't it? So let's start at the beginning, so sort of what's going on in the mouth and the teeth. Many vertebrates, although not all, do have some sort of teeth structure. The teeth are used for chewing, for the physical breakdown of large pieces of food. This process of chewing and breaking down food physically is referred to as mastication. Now, birds don't have teeth. If you look at birds, we look at sort of the ancestral history of birds. They don't have teeth. At one point, the ancestors did, but they lost those over evolutionary time. But they still need to be able to break down food. They still need to be able to break down large pieces of food that is ingested physically, not just relying on chemical breakdown. So what they actually do is they have their stomach that's split into what's referred to as a two-chambered stomach. So one of these chambers is very similar to what our stomach does, but the other chamber is referred to as the gizzard. This is a muscular chamber, and they actually inject pebbles that are stored in the gizzard. If you've ever seen a bird picking up a pebble or a very small rock or something like that, it's not doing that because it thinks it's pretty or whatever. It's actually ingesting that to store this in the gizzard, and these basically are used like teeth. The gizzard, when food is ingested, you still have large pieces of unbroken down food that enter the gizzard. That then churns, and because you have these small rocks and pebbles in there, that physically breaks down the food into smaller pieces that can then go and be processed in the stomach. So even though they don't have teeth, they still engage in this physical breakdown of food. They just do it basically by using a tool, the small rocks. Now when you look at teeth, you can actually use teeth to identify sort of what kind of feeding behavior an organism has. As we talk about the digestive system, and later on when we're talking about sort of an overview of it, of the different differences, you'll see that digestive systems vary significantly based on if you're a carnivore or you're an herbivore. And one of the first ways we see these differences is with the teeth. With carnivores, they have very pointed teeth, they have sharp teeth. The teeth don't really have grinding surfaces. The teeth in carnivores are adapted for ripping and tearing flesh. They need to bite off large chunks of food, of meat, of muscle tissue, and that is a very tough product. You basically need to have knives in order to do that. What do we do when we have a steak that we're eating? We use a knife to cut it up. Carnivores can't do that, so their teeth serve the same purpose. So the teeth of carnivores have this sort of knife-like characteristic. Herbivore teeth are very different. When you're eating cellulose, when you're eating plant material, you have to grind it and sort of crush it very readily. It's not just a question of sort of tearing it off. So the herbivore teeth generally are very large, flat teeth that are suited for sort of grinding cellulose together, breaking the cell walls that are found in plant tissues. So how many people here have ever used a mortar and pestle? Chemistry class or something like that, or maybe you're in cooking. But that's the same idea. You're basically grinding this material down to break it into smaller pieces. Now, omnivores have sort of the best or the worst of both worlds. They need to be able to have sort of these ripping and tearing teeth to take pieces of flesh, to take pieces of muscle, but they also need to have these grinding teeth. So they actually have a split of their teeth where the teeth in the front are the carnivore teeth. These are the ones that are very sharp, that used for ripping and tearing. The teeth in the back are the herbivore-like teeth that are used for grinding and sort of breaking down the cellulose. So if you look at a skull and you look at the dentition pattern, you can predict what kind of food it's going to eat based on the relative size and shape of the teeth. If the size and the shape of the incisors and the canines are extremely large, if the premolars are very sharp as well, those are probably going to be carnivores. On the other hand, if the incisors and canines are relatively small and you have extreme amounts of molars and premolars that are all very flat, those are probably going to be herbivores. If you have a combination of the two, those are going to be omnivores. So once food enters the mouth and begins this process of digestion, the tongue is actually there to sort of mix the food with saliva. Saliva serves two different purposes. One of these is to moisten and lubricate the food. When you engage in the swallowing process, it's a lot easier to swallow something if it's moistened and slightly wet. It's going to be able to slip down the esophagus much more readily. So saliva serves the purpose of sort of lubricating the food so it can be passed to the stomach very easily. But saliva also contains salivary amylase. Salivary amylase is an enzyme that starts the breakdown of starch. Starch is a carbohydrate. So even in the mouth, we start this chemical breakdown process. We usually think of the mouth as a physical process for breakdown, but we do have some chemical digestion that begins in the mouth. We don't have mouth, we don't have any absorption, but we start to break down some of these carbohydrates. Now, salivation is controlled by the nervous system. Is it a conscious mechanism or not conscious?
Not conscious.
Subconscious. It's controlled by the nervous system, but it's not under conscious control. And in fact, there are a lot of different things that start stimulating the salivation process. If you start thinking about food, start tasting food, smelling food, this all starts the process of salivation, sort of your body getting ready to start eating something. If I start describing a pizza that's sitting up here, it has sort of a little bit of the garlic smell of the pizza sauce, cheese dripping all over the place, and some nice big pepperonis on it or something like that, your mouth starts salivating. You don't even have to have food present in order to start the salivation process. It's strong, and the reflex is strong enough so that even just thinking about food by itself will start this process. Now everyone wants to eat pizza. So once food leaves the esophagus, or once food leaves the mouth, it's going to enter the esophagus. The esophagus is just this muscular tube that connects the mouth to the stomach. Okay? So with this tube, it's basically there to just make sure food reaches the stomach. Now, as you saw in the animation, we don't have a perfect system. What's one thing that is a problem with the way that our esophagus system sets up?
It's next to the respiratory.
It's next to the respiratory system. How many people here have ever swallowed food down the wrong tube? Or you drink some water and you start coughing or something like that? I would hope everyone, because it's a pretty common thing to happen. But that's sort of a flaw in the design of the vertebrate digestive system. The generalized vertebrate digestive system, you actually have the same opening for food as for respiration. And the problem with this is it can lead to choking. So if you were going to design a system, you would probably want to try and split a system into two where the food and the respiratory systems are not connected to each other. Now the esophagus, as food moves through the esophagus, it's now referred to as a bolus. This is simply a mass of partially chewed, salivated food that's lubricated and moving through as it enters the stomach. It moves through a process of muscular contractions called peristalsis. Now, when you're chewing food and you start the process of swallowing, is that a conscious or subconscious behavior? Conscious. You have to think about swallowing. Now, you don't have to sit here, okay, move my tongue, do this, start the muscle contractions up here. It's sort of all connected, but you do have to sit here and say, okay, I'm going to initiate this swallowing behavior. But once food enters the esophagus, it is no longer under conscious control. It's going to be moving through muscular contractions, but they're going to be under non-conscious control, and so that's going to push the food down through the stomach. So the swallowing center of the brain is what stimulates these muscular contractions. Once you swallow food, that then sort of signals the brain to start these muscular contractions. So the swallowing itself is under conscious control. The esophagus contractions are not. Now, once it gets to the end of the esophagus, you have a sphincter that allows food to enter the stomach. A sphincter is going to be sort of any muscular closing that's going to act as a one-way valve. It's going to allow food to pass through in one direction. Why do we not want food going back up the other direction from the stomach up the esophagus? It's acidic. It's going to cause damage. And actually, this is a problem here because humans don't actually have a true sphincter. There are many animals that do have a true sphincter there. It is physically impossible for food to travel this wrong direction. Humans don't have a true sphincter. They have a muscular closing, but it is not extremely efficient. And so occasionally we do have food that backs up. It starts to go from the stomach back up the esophagus. This is basically what heartburn is. Heartburn, you're having the acidic chyme that's in the stomach sort of flow back up a little bit. It causes this burning sensation because it is acidic. It is burning the tissues of the esophagus. And so because we don't have this true sphincter, we have this heartburn process. So this is sort of what peristaltic movement is in the esophagus. You have these muscular contractions where the behind the bolus, the muscles contract a little bit, sort of squeezing that bolus down. Same kind of thing as if you're squeezing a tube of toothpaste or something like that. You squeeze behind it and it pushes that bolus down towards the stomach. Now, once it reaches the stomach, we have this large sac-like structure. That's basically all a stomach is, just this big sac that can hold the bolus once it enters. Now, one thing that's interesting about the stomach is it does have a lot of folds in it. Normally, when we talk about folds, we're talking about folds to increase surface area, like in the small intestines, to aid in absorption of nutrients. But there is no absorption that occurs in the stomach. So why do you think we have these folds? Expansion. So this convoluted surface, this folded surface of the stomach, allows for the stomach to expand. And in fact, it is the expanding stomach that sort of stimulates the sensation of being full that triggers someone to stop eating. At some point, you feel full. It's not because your stomach is literally full of food, but it's because the expansion of the stomach stimulates certain nerves that triggers the brain to say, okay, it's now time to stop eating. So these folds serve two purposes. They not only allow the stomach to hold more, but they also trigger the process to stop feeding. Now, the stomach contains a third layer of smooth muscle cells that allow for the stomach to churn a little bit to mix the food together with the gastric juices, with the fluids that the stomach is producing. This is a form of physical digestion. It can physically break down food particles So you do have physical digestion also occurring in the stomach, not just chemical digestion. Now the stomach has three kinds of cells that actually secrete material as a liquid to produce sort of this liquid material that begins the chemical process of digestion. So if we look at the stomach here, we have these three layers of muscles that allow for the churning. We have these folds that allow for expansion. There's a mucus lining that we'll talk about momentarily. Food enters in through the esophagus. There's no true sphincter here. We do have the pyloric sphincter, however, that it controls when food leaves the stomach. So the three cells that are found in the stomach that are responsible for secreting are all secreting different things. One of these are mucus-secreting cells. Mucus-secreting cells secrete a mucus that lines the stomach itself. The other cells secrete an acid. Anyone know what kind of acid it is? Hydrochloric acid. That's a really strong, powerful acid. That'll eat through stomach lining very easily. So what the mucus cells do is they create this mucus lining to help protect the stomach itself, protecting it from itself so that the hydrochloric acid does not basically digest the stomach. The only thing that's going to be digested is what's inside the stomach. You have parietal cells. These are the cells that actually secrete the hydrochloric acid. They also secrete another factor that's responsible for B12 absorption later on that sort of helps break down B12. And then you have the chief cells. These secrete pepsinogen. In the acidic content of the stomach, pepsinogen when it's secreted is inactive. Once it hits the acidic nature of the hydrochloric acid, it activates and turns into pepsin, and pepsin is responsible for breaking down proteins. So if we're talking about sort of what kinds of molecules are being broken down in different areas, what's being broken down in the mouth chemically? The salivary amylase? Carbohydrates. Then we also now begin the process of breaking down proteins in the stomach with the pepsin. Yes?
Like the mucus secreting cells, like is there a chance that they rip or somehow or like they tear apart and like is that how like an ulcer occurs?
There are multiple ways that ulcers can form. They can actually be caused by viruses. They can be caused by tears in the lining. They can be caused by stress. So there's a lot, but basically when you have an ulcer, you do have this sort of sensitive area where the mucus is not being as effective. So this is sort of what it looks like as a close-up of the stomach cells. We have these gastric pits. These are where all the materials are being secreted. This is the lining of the cell. You have the three muscle layers. If you look at a close-up of the gastric pits, we have the mucus cells that secrete the mucus. We have the chief cells that secrete the pepsinogen. We have the parietal cells that secrete the hydrochloric acid. And so each of those gastric pits appears throughout the entire stomach. So the entire stomach is sort of secreting all of these fluids and mixing that through this churning action with the bolus. Once you have this mixing take place, then it no longer is referred to as a bolus. The mixture between sort of this acidic liquid and the food is now referred to as chyme. So as I mentioned, the low pH in the stomach, because of this hydrochloric acid, helps denature the proteins. It activates the pepsin. This keeps the pepsin functioning so that you can then continue to break down proteins. So you have this breakdown into the proteins to amino acids that starts in the stomach. So what have we not broken down so far? We've started the chemical digestion of carbohydrates. Here we're starting the chemical digestion of proteins. Lipids. So we haven't started breaking down lipids at all. That does not occur until the food enters the small intestine. So in the stomach itself, there is no significant breakdown of lipids, but there's also no significant breakdown of carbohydrates. We started the chemical process of breakdown of carbohydrates in the mouth, but we don't have any additional activity until it reaches the small intestine as well. There is some slight absorption of water. The cells that surround the stomach lining can absorb some water. They don't absorb any nutrients, any vitamins, minerals, ions, or anything like that. The only thing that they might absorb is water. Now, as you have this mixture taking place between the digested food and these gastric juices, as I referred to, it's now called chyme. And chyme is what's going to be passing through into the small intestine. It's still very acidic in nature, hydrochloric acid. And so as it passes through, the body's going to need some way to sort of relieve itself and protect itself from this acidic chyme. The chyme leaves the stomach through the pyloric sphincter. Once this churning and the initial digestion of protein takes place, the pyloric sphincter will open. The chyme then passes into the small intestine. The small intestine itself is extremely long. On an average human, it's about 4.5 meters long. Doesn't seem that small. But the reason why it's referred to as the small intestine is because of the diameter of the tubes itself. Now, the small intestine is broken down into three different areas. You have the duodenum, the jejunum, and the ileum. It's basically just three different portions of the small intestine. The duodenum is the portion that's directly connected to the stomach. The ileum is the portion that's directly connected to the large intestine. As the food passes into the small intestine, what's happening is the small intestine is receiving the chyme from the stomach, but it's also receiving digestive enzymes and bicarbonate from the pancreas. What did I tell you that bicarbonate does?
Buffer.
It acts as a buffer. It neutralizes acids. So in order to protect the body, the pancreas, as food is being moved into the small intestine, is releasing this buffer to neutralize the hydrochloric acid. If it didn't, then you'd be in big trouble, because the small intestine does not have the mucus cells that secrete a mucus to protect the lining. So you need to eliminate or neutralize this acid in order to allow the system to remain intact. It also then receives bile from the liver and gallbladder. Bile is involved in the emulsification or the breakdown of fatty acids and lipids. Now, if you look at a small intestine, the epithelial layer is covered in these small projections that are referred to as villi. Villi are just these small folds that are found throughout the small intestine, and they increase the surface area. If you look at a close-up of a villi, of a villus, you'll see that those actually have small folds in them as well that are referred to as microvilli. So basically, we're having folds of the small intestine itself. Those folds are covered with projections called villi. Those villi are covered with projections called microvilli. So it's a huge, huge increase in the surface area of the small intestine. Anytime we see any sort of increase in surface area, the first thing that you should be thinking about is it's involved in some sort of absorption. So the microvilli aid in this process begin the process of absorbing food and absorbing nutrients from the food that's been ingested. They also aid in the process of digestion because you can have things secreted from the microvilli, but the primary reason we have this huge surface area is to increase the efficiency of absorption. Now, the small intestine has three accessory organs that are associated with it. It has the liver, the gallbladder, and the pancreas. Each of these are going to be secreting material into the small intestine as the chyme passes through. So the pancreas secretes what we refer to as pancreatic fluid. This is secreted into the duodenum every time the pyloric sphincter opens up and chyme enters. The little small opening that it's secreted through into the duodenum is referred to as a pancreatic duct. So the pancreatic fluid contains digestive enzymes. Some of these are responsible for breaking down proteins. So you have trypsin and chymotrypsin that are found in the pancreatic fluid. These are going to continue the process that was started by the pepsin in the stomach and break down proteins into polypeptides and ultimately into amino acids. You also have pancreatic amylase. Pancreatic amylase is going to break down polysaccharides. So we started the process of polysaccharide breakdown with salivary amylase. It's continued with pancreatic amylase to break down these sugars into smaller basic sugar monomers. Then you also have lipase. Lipase breaks down fatty acids and lipids into free fatty acids and monoglycerides. These can then be absorbed by the cells. So once you have chyme entering the stomach, this is where you start to break down all the different kinds of biological molecules. You break down the proteins, you break down the carbohydrates, you break down the lipids. And all of those enzymes are found in the pancreas. Now, the pancreas also releases the bicarbonate that is responsible for neutralizing the hydrochloric acid because you want to eliminate this acidity. Now, the liver is another accessory organ. There are actually multiple functions of the liver. But in terms of digestion, the liver is responsible for secreting a specific kind of fluid. Now, the liver itself is the body's largest internal organ. If you were to look at all the different internal structures in the body, the liver is going to be the largest. Is it the largest organ altogether?
No.
No.
What's the largest organ?
Skin.
Skin. Oh, you guys already know that. Okay. So what the liver secretes to aid in the process of digestion is bile. And what bile does is it contains bile pigments, which ultimately end up as waste products, because the liver is also responsible for filtering out waste from the blood. And so it needs to get rid of these waste products. It secretes them as bile pigments into the small intestine so that they can then be excreted in feces. But the bile also contains bile salts. And bile salts are aid in the process of emulsification. Now, what's a chemical characteristic of lipids or fatty acids? They're insoluble. And why is that?
They have that layer. Hydrophobic.
Hydrophobic. They're hydrophobic in nature. Now, if we think about the basic composition of things like saliva, of the fluid that's in the stomach, there's going to be a significant amount of water in that. And so what happens is what happens when you put a fat in water? Sort of forms little bubbles. If you pour a little bit of like cooking oil or something like that in a big flat bottle of water, it sort of stays in itself. It doesn't mix with the water. So what happens is as you start ingesting fats, you have very large, basically globules of fat in the liquid form that are being passed through. They're not being able to be broken down because of the hydrophobic nature, they're going to continue to conglomerate together. So what bile salts do is they engage in this emulsification process. Emulsification is simply breaking down these large globules of fat into smaller globs that can be broken down at some point chemically. So it's sort of the same idea as physical breakdown of food, except it's done using these bile salts. Because if they remain hydrophobic, they remain continually separated and sort of clumped together, then it's going to be impossible to break them down. The third accessory organ is the gallbladder. The gallbladder is very closely tied with the liver. So the gallbladder sort of stores and concentrates the bile that the liver produces. And so then when the bile is needed, rather than have a lot of it being secreted directly from the liver, the gallbladder sort of serves as the gateway organ, the gateway structure that secretes the bile as needed. When you have fatty foods that arrive in the duodenum, so they're being passed from the stomach into the small intestine, this triggers the endocrine response of the gallbladder releasing this concentrated bile. So it physically stimulates the gallbladder to contract. It has bile inside of it, so that's just literally going to be squeezing bile into the duodenum. Now, is the gallbladder necessary?
No.
No. It's an accessory organ that helps sort of improve the efficiency of the bile. It helps improve the efficiency of the liver, but without the gallbladder, the liver can still secrete bile directly into the duodenum. And in fact, if anyone's ever had their gallbladder removed, you're still able to survive perfectly well. You do have to be careful with fatty foods, however. If you ever have a surgery to remove your gallbladder, you're still going to be able to eat whatever you want, but they'll tell you, don't eat a lot of fatty foods. Be careful how rapidly you ingest them, because you no longer have this ability to sort of regulate the production and the release of bile. So your digestion of the fatty foods is not going to be as easy. It's not going to be as efficient. Now, bile that's secreted by the gallbladder is transported through the common bile duct, and this is also where you have bile that can be secreted directly from the liver itself and then into the duodenum. So this is sort of what the duodenum looks like. You have the food that's going to be entering from the stomach. They don't show that here. You have the pancreatic duct, where you have the pancreatic fluids that are being released. You have the common bile duct, where the bile is going to be released. You have the gallbladder that can help store bile. And so it's basically just going to act as a storage sac that can be squeezed to release additional bile. But then you also have bile that can be directly released from the liver itself. Now, in addition to helping break down food in the small intestines is also responsible for the beginning of the absorption of nutrients. As you have this breakdown taking place, you now have all three kinds of biological molecules, carbohydrates, lipids, and proteins that are being broken down in the small intestine. This is creating a series of monomers, these nutrients that can then be absorbed. So amino acids and monosaccharides are going to be absorbed the same way. They're going to be transported directly through the epithelial cells to the bloodstream itself. Because amino acids and monosaccharides can be passed through the cell layers. They're going to be they're going to be soluble in water. They're hydrophilic in nature. But what's the molecule that's not hydrophilic? Lipids. So when you have these amino acids and monosaccharides, they're going to pass through the epithelial layer directly into the bloodstream. The blood is then going to carry these to the liver, because I mentioned the liver is involved in filtering out blood, and then eventually those will be passed throughout the entire body. But the lipids are going to be different. The fatty acids, the monoglycerides that are being produced through the digestion of lipids have to first diffuse into the epithelial cells, but then they're not going to be passed immediately into the bloodstream. Instead, once they're entered the epithelial cells of the small intestine, they're going to be further processed. So they're reassembled. So you have the monomers for the lipids, but they're going to be reassembled into triglycerides, and then those are going to be put together into chylomicrons. And so you actually have chemical reassembly taking place. You have a breakdown that takes place in the small intestines of the lipids, but then once they enter the epithelial cells, you reassemble them into larger molecules, you reassemble the monomers. Those are then going to enter the lymphatic system and eventually be passed into the circulatory system. So while the monomers for the amino acids and the monomers for the carbohydrates directly enter the circulatory system, the lipids sort of have this circuitous route where they're reassembled in the epithelial, they go through the lymphatic system, and then they pass into the circulatory system. So all fluid, or almost all fluid that's found in the chyme, is reabsorbed in the small intestine. So water is going to be reabsorbed out as well. We also have water reabsorption in the large intestine, but it begins the process in the small intestine. So if we look at this process of absorption of these three molecule types, we have the proteins that are broken down into the amino acids. These are the monomers. Those pass through the epithelial layer directly into the blood. We have the carbohydrates that are broken down into the monosaccharides. Those are the monomers. Those pass through the epithelial layer directly into the blood. The fatty acids are emulsified, so these are the large fat globules, the droplets that I was talking about. The bile salts help emulsify them, breaking them down into smaller droplets that are then broken down into monoglycerides. These are the monomers. Those are absorbed into the epithelial layer. Once they're there, they're reassembled into triglycerides, into chylomicrons, which are sort of conglomerations of triglycerides. Those do not pass into the bloodstream. Those pass into the lymphatic system. So it's important to make sure you remember this distinction about what's happening with the absorption of nutrients in the small intestine. So now that brings us to the large intestine, or what's referred to as the colon. The large intestine is much smaller, but it has a much larger diameter. So when people were looking at these initially, they saw the small tubes. These were referred to as the small intestine, even though if you stretch them out, it's very long. They saw the large diameter tubes. These were referred to as the large intestine. So the small intestine empties material into the large intestine. Most of the nutrients have already been absorbed by this point. That's one reason why the small intestine is so long, because it passes through to allow sufficient time for absorption of nutrients. Most of the water has been absorbed in this point. The food has been completely digested. So once you enter the large intestine, you no longer have any breakdown taking place. Now, the large intestine itself has two small structures referred to as the cecum and the appendix. These are primarily responsible for aiding digestion in the herbivores. Basically, what they do is they're thought to hold cellulose-digesting bacteria. Now, is the appendix necessary in humans? No. Anyone here have an appendix removed? One person? You can remove the appendix. You actually sometimes need to if you have a burst appendix. And so you can remove that, and you still are able to engage in the process of digestion because we really don't have any of these cellulose-digesting bacteria. We can engage in this digestion process. So we'll continue talking about digestion on Friday with the large intestine.